Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the IDRiM podcast, where we talk about disaster research and all the disasters. Well, today there will be no guests, but this us, me and Mark will chatter about one of the most pressing issues of our time, which is climate change, and how people, especially young people, are responding to it. Despite the headlines, memes, and protests, there is still so much we don't know about the how people or young people are perceiving, engaging, and reacting to climate change, especially in the UK, which is this is the specializations of my co-host here. So today we will talk all about his ongoing research from his PhD and uh, all the breakthrough that he found after the PhD, and he will uncover the fascinating insights on these very topics. And from all the research he's done, surveys, interview, and the workshops, and his work paints a rich picture of belief, behavior, and barriers. So let's get into it. How do you feel about today, Mark?
I feel good. Where I am in the UK right now, so I'm recording this on the 12th of May. It's been dry, as we were discussing before the podcast we start recording. It's so this year has been almost a wake up call for climate change, you could say, in the UK. So where I live, so in the northeast of England, it is a relatively dry part of the UK. I'm not going to deny. We in April only had 8% of usual rainfall. So it gives you a sense of how weird the weather is. We're on course for the sunniest spring on record, which is it's glorious, but it's also box dry. And it is a concern. And I think that for to tell the climate change story, and we're going to get into that, this has been a bit of a weird year. A good and a bad way of trying to illustrate to younger people the risks associated with climate change here in the UK.
Oh, looks fascinating, and I cannot wait to hear more. So let's start with the big pictures. So what drew you to explore this kind of topics, especially the young people perceptions of climate change for your research?
So I come from a research institute, and as anyone who is watching on YouTube will notice today, I've changed my background to represent it better. So my department, so Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences here at Northumbria, is it's a mixed department of human and physical geographers. But when it comes to climate change, a lot more of the emphasis for us has been on the science, the physical hardcore sciences. So we do a lot as a department on Arctic and Antarctical, glacial melt rates and ice caps and ice sheets. So there's a lot of research more aimed at that. Now, obviously, within our department, there's a subset which is disasters, which is where that's where I come through with Professor Andrew Collins, and back in the day, Professor Phil O'Keefe. So he was actually my first ever mentor, and he helped me guide my way through climate change in particular. So in the early days with climate change, and actually the story of why I got into this weirdly goes back much further before university. So for me, the story comes back to when I was about so we've talked about in previous podcasts, I got really interested in disasters, etc. After Katrina and the 2003 heat wave. But this type of where I'm at right now was not my first choice of research and what I wanted to do when I was younger. So so as I was coming up to 16, 17, 18, what I wanted to do was actually meteorology. And I wanted to just focus, study weather and get into the hardcore sciences of weather. And I was didn't I just wasn't that strong in physics. I'm going to be completely honest. I was good at certain parts of physics, so nuclear physics, I could understand. I was quite good at it. But when it came to the very hardcore mechanical and the quantum physics, I just struggled. So I knew I wasn't going to get so basically where I would have wanted to go was University of Reading, which has the #1 course on meteorology in the UK. I knew I would never have got in with my predicted grades, and because of these difficulties I had in physics. So what I did instead was I thought, well, I took a step back thinking, I still want to do this, but I know that I'm not going to be able to do that. So I started thinking, what else am I, strong in? And I was generally quite strong in geography, and that's how I moved into it. And I could actually I found it later on I could incorporate a lot more different elements of what I like and what I was good at, and that's how I got into it. Now we're back to the bit with Phil O'Keefe. Is that when we do my undergraduate, I was really interested in climate change, and he helped me guide me through research on what local government was doing on climate change because it was an area that it was relatively unexplored. And we were talking about this, and then as I moved in to do my masters, this is where I started to really get this interest in climate change and how people perceive climate change. And what I started to realize was that there was data out there and there was some research, but a lot of the data started to miss young people. And so I was trying to break a mold, and I knew that I really wanted to do a PhD on this, but I also was doing a master's dissertation at the same time. So I was like, well, I don't want to do a whole master's dissertation on what I want my PhD to do. So I was like, okay, I'll do a very broad, general master's one on climate perception and how people view climate change, and then I used the PhD to go into more detail. And that's basically how I started. And it actually married a lot of other stuff that today and in the past I was more interested in. So back in 2016, at this point, I was already leading the Northumbria Disaster and Development Society, which was a way of getting young people into talking about disasters. So I was already, even at the start of my PhD, I was already doing disasters in young people. So this was kind of an extension to it. And as you know, today in IDRiM, it's my role today as the committee chair of the Young Scientist Session is to the same aspect. And a lot of my research, as we're going to go on to, it's me again and again looking at young people and how they get into science and research. So basically, that's where it all started from.
What's compelling background, if I may say, because like you come through many different peoples and look at how you engage with your surroundings and then come to their research. So as you mentioned that at that time you're doing the research, it's relatively unexplored, and now we see that the climate change is a huge global problems, and you also describe this in your research as one of the greatest societal challenges of the 21st century, right? Before you come to your research, do you feel that the young people taking it seriously enough? Before, I mean, like at that time you decided to do this, what's your initial thought about young people at that time looking at the climate change, and whether their voice has been set line in conversations about this?
So back in 2015-16, no, absolutely not. And it's quite funny. So back in 2015-16, climate change was, we say, you mentioned, I say it's one of the greatest societal issues and challenges. Yes, and it's it's been like that for years. But what is different is it 2015-16, and my research does show this, is that the public knew bits of it, but it wasn't a big issue. I mean, you wouldn't hear it every day, on the news. Today, you would hear some element of it every day. Back in 2015-16, it was kind of it was still a scientific issue that was up for debate. Of course, it wasn't up for debate. We knew about this, but it wasn't out in the public consciousness and sphere that this was a big issue that needed to be tackled now. And I think a part of that, and I do mention it into my PhD document at the time, was we had this peak. We've seen it, in America, we've seen it in the UK in the late 2000s, but there were a number of crises in the science and the policy, and weirdly enough, with the weather. It knocked a lot of confidence and a lot of belief out of people. So, I mean, you've got the Climate Gate scandal out at the University of East Anglia in Pennsylvania. You've got, you had the 2010 Copenhagen, 2009, sorry, Copenhagen conference on climate change. Basically, pretty much most of it collapsed in trying to get new targets. And then we had, a relatively, I would say, not warmer, but cooler, but a few years where the weather seemed to settle a little bit more. So the attention just turned away, and I think that for young people at the time, because it wasn't out there, young people were not paying that sort of level of attention. And actually, it's one of them weird things with young people, and we'll get onto this, is that when it's major societal issues, do young people really tune in to these issues? And there is different schools of thought on this, and I think that it's quite fascinating, especially in my role today. And again, we'll probably come on to this about what I actually do today in workshops, as we were mentioning, and my understanding of how they engage. And it is a very fascinating area, and it's an area that, unless you're in that setting, you don't know how young people are perceiving it.
Oh, it's interesting take on that. Especially in that I think you did a lot of interviews and surveys and workshops, and
Mm.
as you mentioned lately in the workshops. And what do you find from all those research, like engaging with young people, whether after your initial thought and then you doing that, the interviews, the surveys, talking and work and doing a workshop with all those young people,
Mm.
and how you found from that, and how that help you get a deeper understanding of the young people perceptions.
Okay, so the way I did it was I took a more general view and then broke it and then narrowed it in. So it was an idea of getting a big survey, get the understandings, and then start to bring it, narrow it into a more what young people, so like like a cross generational comparison. What was interesting was that young people generally were more, had this concern, had a higher degree of concern, but that concern was it's based upon what they've been told. So that means that concern kind of can move around a little bit. So what we find is that in the terms of their beliefs, they are, as research will show, they are the most likely to believe that climate change is real because they have been taught that it is real. But when you start looking on, can they talk about examples of where it is, and using life experience, that's a little bit harder for them. So, and that's natural. That's going to be natural, and that will change over time as they observe changes into the climate. So, and it's and just break away from young people for a second. You can see this. So, one of my research papers that is currently in for review at the minute actually talks about how older people view extreme weather events and how they view that in relation to, and how does that feed into beliefs for climate change. So when we talk about older people, they have a tendency to look at extreme events and then cross compare it to modern day. So one of the things that comes up, and just a disclosure, I live with my grandparents, and they're 78 and 80, and I see elements of this with them. I see elements with other family members. Is that they will compare weather from when they were young to today. So when we're talking about young people, you do formulate, or when you're 10 to 20, usually you start formulating ideas that this is natural, this is what it should be. And as the climate changes, because climate change is not one of those it's not, it's a disaster, but it's not like a disaster that's like a earthquake or a tsunami where it happens quite quickly and suddenly. It's a slow onset disaster which takes 20, 30, 40, 50 years before a lot of people start to notice it. And one of the things that in particular in the UK is that we compare it to, there are two ways to compare it, and these two ways will formulate what type of person you are in terms of climate change. The first one is very much a snowfall event, and you look at winter. So what happens is that people start to look at, if they're older, they'll look at extreme snowfall events, and they'll look at today's weather and say, well, back in my day, we had these heavy snowfall events. And then what they do is they also move over to and then so they say, oh, that must be an example of it. So that if there's not a lot of snowfall today and the UK doesn't get a lot of snowfall, that must mean it's warmer winter. So there is climate change. And that's quite a logical thing. But this change is, I call, snow nostalgia in my research. So what happened is that there's one event where in my research, this elderly person in an interview said, talked about, this heavy force. I remember when I can't remember the exact age now, but I remember the snowfall events in 1957, in 1957, 58. And she remembers about this heavy snowfall event. And she said, we don't get snow like that today. So that shows an example of how the climate is changing. And what I started doing my research was like, okay, what was the weather like the year before and the year after? And what we found was it wasn't that dissimilar to winters of today. It was pretty normal. And what they do is they take these examples and they use it because you can only remember the extreme. I mean, if you think about it, when we go back, remember how the weather was, when we were younger, we tend to have this thing about, these extreme events we remember more than we remember, just a rainy day that is pretty, bog standard. And it's like, I remember 2003. Now, I know because of my research, I know not to compare it to 2003 because 2003 was an exceptional year. But I also worry about, younger people as they get, older, they're going to do the same thing as the generation that's behind. They'll compare to 2022, where the UK had 40 degrees of heat, and they'll start doing that. Now, I said there were two ways that people would look at it, and that's the second way: heat waves. And what we have a tendency to do is that the skeptics, the more older skeptics, what they'll do is they'll look at heat waves and say, oh, in 1976 it was this hot. We didn't say, and today, it's not as hot, or it's, so therefore the climate is not changing, or it is changing because in 76 it's this, that. Yes, that's one weather event. We're not talking about frequency, intensity. They're just talking about, because remember it one heat wave, therefore, oh, it can't be climate change. And going back to your question from about 5-10 minutes ago, about how people view it, young people view climate change, is this is the way that this is the concern, is that young people, they view climate change as they'll be taught it, but as they are getting older now, they'll be forming perceptions based upon lived experience. And this lived experience is going to be it's going to be formative of how they're going to behave in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. The one last thing we need to remember is that, and this is the element which we have to always try to fight with climate skepticism, is that if we do succeed in achieving our goals and stopping climate change, the likelihood is that the skeptics will view us as liars. Because if you've achieved your goal, you've stopped the worst of climate change. But they're not observing that stoppage. They're observing that the climate hasn't changed. I mean, if we look at this is how the skeptics have done this. They say in the 1980s we talked about acid rain. It didn't happen. The 1990s, the ozone layer. It didn't happen. So a lot of the skeptics will tend to use that, and they'll put it onto social media, like TikTok or Twitter back in the day. And young people are using these TikToks, and if they're seeing that, and I do see it in classrooms where they will push back some students on this because they've seen this, and it raises more questions about, are young people being exposed to a lot of misinformation with it? I mean, young people are better at dealing with misinformation than older people, but younger people are exposed to more than any of us have ever been exposed to. And it gets to the point where if you're exposed to that much misinformation, do you question what is true and what isn't true to the point where you start believing nothing is true? And that's my worry with younger people. And I do see bits of it where do they believe what I'm trying to, teach them? Sorry for a very long, rambling answer to that question.
Well, I mean that's what I found interesting. That lot to unpack from that. That for example, about how the young people's although as you mentioned, it's because they have been taught it's like some sort of doctrine that they are doctrined to believe that the climate change is now happening, right? And then you put another case studies that where how the old peoples actually look at how the climate is changing towards their own experience, looking at how the cold and hot differences, right, in the snow and the heat wave, and then you come to misinformations. So let's discuss all these interesting things one by one. But the first thing that I would like to discuss, like since you mentioned that the young people will be the one who experience this the critical shifts in the future, in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the 20 years, and then we'll do the similar thing as their older counterparts doing the comparisons, then why do they have the such high belief in the beginnings if they don't have the capabilities to compare in their lifetimes? And then after they acquire more experiences living with, let's say, changing climates, will they said that, well, since the climate's already changing, and they said that, oh, okay, I don't really feel the differences, let's say, because, like, okay, there's no snow that I experienced in my life, but because, like, what they see throughout their life perhaps is already changing climates instead of the previous climate that they not experience. What do you think about this?
So I think one of the reasons why younger people have a tendency to believe that the climate is changing is, and this is a bit of a critique of education itself, is that they all have a tendency to parrot what they've been taught, and they won't critically push back on ideas. And it's something that it's a bit of a weird one where I'm trying to teach them at the minute with, techniques I'm doing to push back, on what I'm saying. And that, because some people might view that as I'm teaching them to, critique against, the science. Yes. But what I'm also doing is, my belief is that if you push back against it and actually do it in the right way, you actually create a better understanding of the science, which then gives a more firmer belief into the science and a more accurate belief. The way that it's taught right now, amongst younger people is basically younger people have a tendency to. Actually, I'll switch it back to you, Harris, for a second. How were you taught climate change when you were at school?
Well, again, it's like since we are in the same generation, and like the climate change in my lifetime perhaps started to, especially in Indonesia, it's actually started to be, more people talk about it when I was in university. But at the times, people, as you mentioned, that people, the buzzwords at that time is either global warming or the ozone layers that already, ripped apart, that we need to close it down. You cannot close it down. And a lot of around greenhouse gases, not really climate change. But closer when well, this is Indonesia, but I'm not sure about UK. Around 2015, 2014, the climate change, it's starting, to be, more and more people talk about that. So it's basically since at the time, as you mentioned, it's already like, it's the teachers or the professors or many, scientists already, keep repeating the name. Oh, we are in the age of global warming, that it's very hot now, like that. So it's Indonesia, for example, we don't have snow, we don't have heat wave, but as the older people said, it's always like, oh, in my age, it's not as hot as now, like that. So it's basically like it's at that time. From what I see at the time, it's like, okay, yeah, it's hotter because like I also experienced that in a way, because like when I live in the child, it's not that hot, and it's getting hotter and hotter. And since I also engage in science, I look into some journals and some scientific magazines, and there is evidence that it's getting increasing. The the ice in the polars getting melted, something like that. So that's what I come to understand, that okay, we are hitting a climate change at that time. But as you mentioned, that the educations, how they the students keep parroting from what their professors said. That's it's like, and now what happens is like now they are experiencing themselves, right?
Yeah, and that's very similar to the UK. So the way that when I was taught it, and I was taught I first came across climate change and taught it when I was 13, 14, I'd like to say, so around 2007-ish. And first of all, 2007 was a bit of in the UK, it was a bit of a bad year to teach, well, bad and good year to teach climate change, because it was a rottenly cold summer, and it rained. And I mean, it rained. It was the worst flooding we've had. So you could say it's bad because it was colder, but it was good because there was a lot more rain in terms of if you wanted to get people to believe it.
Yeah.
Now, climate education in the UK is definitely going backwards, not forwards in the UK. And I say this to classes that I work with today, but you probably get taught less than I got taught. Now, we know that the science of climate change is evolving all the time. And we going back to the question you asked me about a couple of minutes ago when we were talking about why do they believe it more, and I said it was about Parry. There's a lot of evidence to prove it, very much so. And actually, it's in a paper that I've submitted. It's in that same paper that I've submitted, and this is based upon the government's own research data from 2019. So in the UK, every 3 months to 12 months, the government will survey the general population on their different beliefs of anything related to climate change and energy. And one of the questions that comes up every 12 months is to get the population to list the impacts of climate change, which impacts are happening. And what's interesting is that there are, and I'll put this up on the screen, there are two groups that have a tendency to have the lowest lowest likely to list impacts. One is the over 65s, which we call the more skeptical group. So what we find is that they don't for some reason, the older generation in the UK don't generally believe that climate change is as big of an issue as younger people. Maybe, and I don't know why. That's one of the areas that really confuses me to this day. I think it's a view that because it hasn't changed as much, it's been subtle, the changes generally, they have a more skeptical view. Even though I said that some do see that change as a more radical change. Depends on which way, they, again, 76, as I mentioned, they see that event, so they say, oh, it can't be that bad then. But the other group is young people. And young people generally, so in 2019, sea level rise, extreme storm events, and erratic weather patterns, they were the lowest on all three. And they were not the highest on any age group. And this is for 16 to 24-year-olds. So they weren't the highest on. They couldn't list the impact higher than any than the highest out of all the age groups, and they were lowest on 3 of the 10, I think it is, age groups on listing them. So what that means is that kind of comes back to a question of that we've seen about parroting is what are they being taught then? They're getting taught the science, the hardcore science behind it, I call it. So they're getting taught about the greenhouse effects, a couple of the greenhouse gases. They're getting taught about the climate, the climate's getting warmer. But what they're not being taught about, and this is something that I think is the issue here, and why I don't believe that the beliefs are being as solidified as they should be, and why I think that young people have a tendency to change their beliefs as they get older, is they're not being taught about what the impacts are, which is where a lot more of my research that is lately been moving towards, is looking at, well, how do you educate in a way that is about belief related to you? And so another example of this is that in, again, that same paper, that paper really unpacks a lot of the modern research I do, and also into a book chapter I've wrote where about are they able to list it's the impacts of climate change in different areas. So what a lot of young people will do is, and it's not just young people, it's all people, generations, they'll have a tendency to say, oh, climate change impacts other countries. It doesn't really impact us that much, or it impacts the country, it doesn't impact us that much in my local community. The likelihood is it does impact them. But what they don't realize is that how it impacts them directly or indirectly. So I mean, even when I talk about impacts, impacts them, indirectly, we talk about agriculture. The UK imports half of its food. What's going to happen if they can't import it? Because there's a drought in Spain or Morocco, where we get most of our winter food from. There's going to be a shortage. But they don't compute that shortage, because of a change in climate, is impacting it. And this is the issue we have here, is that it's the way that climate change is being discussed and taught in schools. It's about a global issue. It's an abstract idea, and less about me and my family and my community. And I feel that that's the issue here. And that's why they have this thing about parroting, because they're not being pushed and, molded into trying to understand it in a better detail. It's just taught like another subject, they'll parrot it. And that's why they'll have the highest belief. But when it comes out actually pushing them, what is it? They don't know. And that's the concern here. And that's why I say about experience, it's quite an important thing, because they'll eventually start making connections, whether it's belief or not believing, as they gain that experience. But surely it's better to bring it in earlier to make them question, because then they'll have a more stronger foundation, and then start relating to experience at a younger age, rather than they start getting that experience when they're in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s. But also, one of the other things is we have to remember that young people do talk about climate change more today. I think the peak obviously was 2019. I think they still generally do talk a lot about it more than previous generations, but I think that it's still the education isn't there, and I think that it's without the education and the experience, they can't link the experience to the reality yet, and that's the sad reality about it.
Yes, you are correct. It's how the young people actually doesn't well still have not you know still don't have pardon my English the capabilities to do to
Mm,
do to compare the experiences, especially I think what you want to say is to look for evidence that they
mm,
can relate into. That's actually the education slacks to actually to connect the real evidence to to the young people educations. Perhaps
mm,
maybe not necessarily to look into the entire globe's food supply chains that will
mm.
affect them, but perhaps like giving more digestible examples that okay, what happens if your supermarket close to your house, and like because of this storms, and you cannot do anything, and that's like that. What's what the climate change is all about.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation between myself and Harris today. This is only part one of a two-part about climate change and how young people view climate change. In part two, in our next episode, we explore more about activism, misinformation of climate change, in particular the role of social media and misinformation related to climate change, and also what is needed in the education structure relating to the teaching of climate change. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we will see you very soon. Bye.